Hi there, students. It's Mr. Verzette. Today we're going to talk about scale as it applies to basic landscape. Let's look at this image, for example. There's actually a speed demonstration of this piece being created on YouTube. I actually encourage you to check it out. But this is an example of scale. Notice what's very close up to us. It's a farm. We have these gigantic human forms, and they're way off in the distance. That tells me that they are humongous. That is scale. Scale refers to how big you make your forms within a piece, and not only how big to make them, but why you make them that big. Here are 3 reasons why scale affects your piece, and why you would make certain things small and certain things big, and so on. It can be affected by several factors, 3 of which are distance. You've learned that in perspective. The further away forms are to you, the smaller they are. Likewise, the closer that same form is to you, then the larger it would be in your piece. Another reason is emphasis, and we'll learn more about emphasis later. It's actually a principle of design that will greatly enhance your work. Emphasis means what part of the piece are you, the artist, focusing on? What's the whole main idea? And on top of that, how do you arrange things within your composition to prop that focal point up? The other reason there's scale in a piece is to tell a story. Basically, how big and small you make things in your piece can tell a story about what's going on in that piece. Where is that world? What's the world about? Why are things so large? Is it ancient? Is it really brand new? And so on. How you juggle those elements affect the story of your piece, and that's the whole purpose of art, to communicate through image. Not just to sit and look pretty, but to say something. How could you tell a story? Well, you could use giant, huge things, like giants, like in this picture, megastructures, or you could have really teeny tiny little gnome cities. The scale of your piece can tell a story. One great way that scale was used in a movie was in the movie Men in Black 2. At the very beginning you see this rocket-like spaceship flying through space, going through wormholes and through galaxies and black holes, and as it's doing this, it's flying by several planets, and it shoots this laser out the bottom of it and blows up the planets. It's like way more deadly than the Death Star in Star Wars. It's just causing destruction and mayhem. And at the end of the beginning credits, you see the ship comes towards Earth, and you're like, oh no, it's just spent the last 2 minutes blowing up all these planets. It's going to do the same thing. And it goes and it lands on the Earth. And when it lands, the camera pans out, and you start to see little blades of grass in front of the ship. And the ship, it turns out, was only like this big. So scale was used to create humor. So you can do a lot using scale in your piece. Another reason why scale is important is because it helps the viewer understand what they're looking at. We live in a 3-dimensional universe, and on top of that, our world is built on rules and laws of physics. And so when we go to look at a representation of that world in art, if the piece doesn't line up to some of those common factors like scale, things getting smaller as they get further away, it won't achieve the desired result. Now there's tons of artwork out there that has like no scale to it. You'll see that on like street signs, icons, non-objective work, and so on. But it helps your viewer understand what they're looking at. It ties it all together. So if you're shooting for a realistic landscape and your scale's off, it's going to be painfully evident in your piece. Scale sets the mood of the piece. If you look at this one in the middle right here, it has kind of an ominous, oh my gosh, here come the giants feeling. Maybe a little bit of anxiety, maybe a little bit of beauty tied in with it, maybe a little bit of awe. So it sets the tone, how big or small you make things in your piece. And finally, kind of going back to an earlier one, it ties the whole piece together. It makes your piece look competent and believable. Now, let's look at an example and let's see how it ties the piece together. The main way that scale ties the piece together is this way, and this is how you would do it in your piece. What you want to do is you want to have a recognizable form in your piece that your viewer can look at and go, oh yeah, that's what that is. And you want to have things next to it to give the viewer a sense of, oh yeah, that's how big it is. Now after that, you've set the stage for how big things are. What you want to do then is scatter some of those forms throughout your piece. So if we look in this one, if we've got grass up in the front, we've also got grass a little bit further away. That helps the viewer know, okay, that's how far away they are from us. And if you scatter elements like that throughout your piece, it is essentially the mortar that holds the bricks together. It makes your piece look realistic. It gives your viewer kind of a set amount of reference points to look at your piece and kind of get in your world. All right, so let's look at some non-examples. I see this all the time with beginning artists, and mainly the reason is because Mainly the reason is because more attention is given to putting things together than actually making them look real for beginners. As a beginner, I strongly suggest that if you're going to draw a form in your piece and then have another form that's recognizable, make them the correct size. Now let's take a look at what that means. Let's look at this house over here, and there's a stick figure form standing right next to him. I see this all the time. How would that person live in that house? That is a very teeny tiny house. Also, look at the door that's in the house, and look at the person who's standing right next to it. The scale is completely off. That's impossible. Unless that's a doghouse and the person climbs through that, then that is not going to make your piece look believable to your viewer. Okay? Let's see how the artist distributed the forms throughout the piece to really bring it together. We have flowers in the foreground and flowers in the middle and background. Those flowers are the same size. Okay, so there's another big problem right there. If you're going to have things receding off in the distance, have some consistency in their size. So they should start getting smaller. Let's look at another example. We've got the stick figure next to the house, okay? And he's kind of established, okay, with us, that's a human. That's how big everything is relative to, say, a normal human size in this world. And then off in the distance, 2 hills back, we've got another stick figure sitting on the top of a hill. All right, so that stick figure is the same size as the one right up close to us. Big mistake. So in your piece, while you're working, always be competent, always be aware of the size of your forms and the relative distance within your piece. So if things are going off in the distance, they're getting smaller. It makes the piece look believable. And ultimately, if I received a piece like this would tell me 2 things. One, either the student didn't watch the screencasts and just doesn't understand the concepts of it, hasn't practiced enough. Maybe the student's visual library in their head of things that they've seen isn't that big. And so if it's for the first case, if it's a lack of background knowledge, then ask me a question. Ask for help. That's why I'm here. I'm here to help you guys. And we can identify those areas that you need to grow in and areas that you're doing good in. And it's through acknowledging those weaknesses that we grow. The second thing it might tell me, if that's not the case, is that the student could just care less. If that's the case, then this isn't the kind of work that's going to get a student through this course to begin with. So avoid this kind of work, regardless of your skill level. Using the techniques is what achieves the effect, not your talent, not your ability, and so on. If you use the techniques, the piece will stand. If you don't, it'll look like this. Let's take a look at a couple of different examples of scale used in your piece. This is an example of scale used for emphasis in a piece. This is a caricature. It's where you draw a portrait of somebody in a funny, cartoony kind of a way. The emphasis is their face. That's how you identify people, through their face. The body and what they're doing is not as important. So that's why the body is made smaller and a lot less detailed than the face. Here's an example from one of my graphic novels. This is how scale was used to create emphasis. The camera was placed really low, and so that means that things that are really up close to the camera are going to look very big. Things that are far away from the camera are going to look small. We call that foreshortening. But the emphasis on this piece was the slashing motion and who was getting slashed. The hero is doing a wicked, vertical kick, and his leg is turned into a blade, and he's slashing this robot guy in half, a villain. And so that was the focus on the piece. And that's how the elements within the piece, the composition, was arranged in order to prop that up. Everything should prop up what the focus of the piece is. And that's how scale was used in this one. Easter Bunny Rampage. Here's an example on how scale is used to create humor. Rabbits are not that gigantic, and typically cute, fluffy ones. This one's really ticked off. So the scale is the scale was used in this one to blow up the focus, the rabbit, to make him huge, to make him threatening, to set the mood of the piece, to give kind of an explosive, dangerous, destructive overtone to it. And that creates humor, because cute, cuddly Easter bunnies are not big, dangerous, destructive forces of nature. And so that's what we call juxtaposition, putting one thing next to an opposite of it to create contrast. And that's how humor can be made sometimes, going back to the Men in Black example I gave you earlier. Here is a piece of art where scale can be used to interact with the viewer. This was a 6-foot-tall watercolor painting that I made of a gigantic cartoony robot. And it is several separate paintings assembled together. So the arm is its own painting, the head is its own painting, the body, the legs, so on, and it's assembled and then stuck together to make this big robot. So it's an interactive piece. And it was made large so that the audience could interact with it, get close, look at it, and so on. Here's an example how scale can tell a story within your piece. Might be a little bit difficult to see on the screencast recording software, but as you can see, we've got some things in the piece that set the tone for how big things are. The silhouettes of these dark leaves that are framing the piece. And right in the middle ground is the story. We've got a little gnome out there working in his garden. He's getting his hat stolen by these fairies, and he lives in the bottom of a smaller tree. So already we know this is a teeny tiny world that we're looking at. Here's how scale can create a real awesome sense of epicness. Really grand expanses, really cool storytelling just through showing a scene without even using words. And here's a little still frame from Lord of the Rings. This is where Gandalf is approaching Minas Tirith, one of the cities of last few standing cities of men, and look at how they set this piece up. They made him small. Even though he's in the foreground, he's tiny. And off in the background, this gigantic, majestic city, right up against a whole bunch of mountains. And so that shows you how big this thing is. It's to communicate a grand sense of ancient scale. You've seen this picture before. The shot wouldn't be as impressive if these people weren't in it, because it'd be one thing to just see a bunch of mountains and clouds from up above. Any plane can do that. But to put these people really close to us gives you a sense of, wow, they're right on the edge of this massive long drop, this fall into an abyss, and it makes the piece all the more grand. Likewise with this sea of clouds. We wouldn't know how big these clouds are unless somebody put this silhouette of a tiny little person in front of us. And the fact that that person in the foreground is really small really brings out the epic grandness of this scene here going off in the distance. I hope you found this helpful. It's a great tool to use, scale, making things big and small to tell a story and also make your piece believable and realistic looking. So if you have any questions, please ask me in class. Also, if there are things that aren't sticking, go back and look at the screencast again. There's a lot of data there, and I need to watch things more than once too. There's nothing wrong with that. So I look forward to seeing you, and have a great day. Bye.